I would move heaven, hell, and anything in between to get to you. You wouldn't be safe anywhere if I was mad at you. And that's not bull, Dip, that's truth. I've went up against people. You could pull a gun on me, and if I'm mad at you, I'm coming forward. You'd have to shoot me to stop me. And if you don't kill me, you're stupid.
Hello, my name is Madison, and you are listening to or watching Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. Welcome back. This is part 4 of my series on Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman Killer. I highly suggest you go back to episode 1 if you somehow just arrived at this video. Regardless, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in, for choosing to click on this video or podcast of all the things that you could be clicking on. I very much appreciate you being here and spending time with me. If you're on the podcast apps, a rating or a like or whatever you're able to do on those, that would be super appreciated. If you're on the YouTube, subscribing would just be the best, or liking or commenting or what have you. It really, really helps me out, and it would be dope of you if you did that. Also, I do have a weekly true crime newsletter. It is called Grim Weekly. You can check it out at grimweekly.com. You can look at old archived issues on grimweekly.com, and you can also sign up. It is free. So do it if you want. And yeah, without further ado, I think we'll just get right into the 4th episode. So just a small recap. Episode 1, we talked about Richard's upbringing, his life, his horrible upbringing, and the beginning of his murderous ways. Episode 2, we talked about mostly his family life and his extreme issues with domestic violence. 3rd episode, we talked about him becoming like a more prominent hitman for the mafia, his work with Roy DeMeo, and a lot of the mafia hits that he says that he was involved in, and the murders that would eventually cause his demise. And so we're going to wrap up a little bit of that because there's definitely more to the story, and things are going to get rocky over here, and like there's a lot to talk about today. Please let me get to the end of it before you decide that I'm wrong, because I'm really going to get to it finally. So first off, last week we talked about sorry, let me just move some of this crap around. So first off, last week we talked about the police beginning their investigation on the B&E boys after Al Rinke got nabbed and turned state's witness. So remember that Richard had started his breaking and entering gang. And at that time I said I didn't know what happened to Percy House. Well, I do know what happened to Percy House. So I had said that Al Rinke was the one who got caught first, and then he started dropping names. So then they had the names of everybody else in the gang except Richard. And so they found Percy House and they arrested him. So Percy House was in the hands of the police, and he was not talking. Unlike Al, he was keeping his mouth shut. That's just the type of guy that he was. And meanwhile, as we know from last episode, while this was all happening, Richard had been able to keep Danny Deppner and Gary Smith in his possession at motels, and then he eventually just killed them. This whole situation with Percy House and Danny Deppner being in police custody kind of is like the keep this in your mind in the background of like everything that I'm going to talk about today, and just like, try to keep up because there are a lot of things going on at once. Just so you know, the arrest of Percy House took place in 1981, and that's also around the time that Al Rinke was put in police custody as well. just so we're clear on the timeline here. So, okay, also at the end of last week, we talked about Richard and Phil Solimene killing Louis Masgay and putting him in that frozen well type thing. And now this did not end as smoothly as Richard had hoped, because Phil decided to kind of run around and start telling everybody about the murder and like kind of using the fact that he was in with Richard as like a threat to other people. Not a smart guy. And it's like, why do all these guys do that? They would be so much more successful if they just learned to keep their mouths shut. But I guess it's good for society, you know. But anyway, this added fuel to everything because, you know, Richard's freaking out. He's rounded up the other two guys, and he's committed all these murders, and now like word is getting out, and he has to try to like tame things. So we had Danny Deppner's wife, Barbara, making all of these claims, and the breaking and entering investigation was going on. So things were very stressful for Richard. In 1983, 2 years after the murder of Louis Masgay, Richard decided that it was too risky to keep him hidden the way that he was, especially with Phil running around, running his big fat mouth. So he decided that he would take Louis's body out, and his hope was that since the body had essentially been frozen for 2 years, it would confuse the police on the timeline of his death. But this did not go well either, because Louis was found a lot faster than Richard had expected. Louis was discovered in Orangetown, New York, and he was wrapped up in garbage bags. And they did initially think that it was a fresh body because he looked like a fresh body. But when the medical examiner opened him up, he was still frozen inside. He still had like ice crystals inside of his body, which they were like, okay, so he was frozen. And apparently, had Richard not left him in the garbage bag, he probably would have been thawed by the time that he was found. But the garbage bag kind of acted as like a insulator, because it was the middle of summer. So he did think that he was just going to thaw out pretty quickly. I don't know how fast a human body thaws, but it must be quite a while. Interesting quandary. And then when they spoke to Louis Masgay's family, they also discovered that he was wearing the same clothes that he'd been wearing the day that he disappeared. Yet another thing that would have been very easy to deal with. Richard, the expert hitman. So, you know, they were like, this is fishy. The freezing situation is where Richard would later get his nickname, the Iceman. And that was really a nickname given to him by the investigators. And it was only 4 months before that the body of Daniel Deppner was found in a wooded area. So Louis Masgay was found September of 83. Daniel Deppner was found, I think, May of 83. And he was found in the wooded area of West Milford, New Jersey. Daniel was also wrapped up in garbage bags. It's clear that he had been shot in the head, but there was no actual signs of poisoning, though it could not be ruled out. So things were adding up, and a certain detective by the name of Pat Kane was the one who kind of started piecing things together and who went on to lead the task force that was assigned to take down the Iceman. And the investigation was very aptly named Operation Iceman. Now, Pat was able to link Richard to the murders of George Maliband, Paul Hoffman, Danny Deppner, Gary Smith, and Louis Masgay. And this was based off of witness testimony that placed Richard as the last person to have been with each of the victims. And he was also able, finally, to crack Percy House, and it had been like years. And he got him to admit that Richard was behind the murders of Masgay, Smith, and Hoffman. This was huge, but as we know, witness accounts and speculation are not enough to convict a person, especially when your witnesses are Al Renke and Percy House, two convicted felons who are going to receive something in exchange for this information. So yes, that was great. And yes, Pat Kane was happy to get that, but obviously that's not enough to take down somebody for murder convictions. Reasonably so, it should not be enough. Now, Pat Kane is kind of an interesting character.
What I told my superiors in Trenton was that Hey, look, we can check with the FBI and we can see that there's a certain number of given serial killers roaming around this country of ours. But take a good hard look at what we got here. We got Richie Kuklinski, and there's only one of him.
Pat is usually portrayed as a detective who was super hardworking and like lived for the job, like lived, breathed, sweated for the job, He really felt that he was onto something with Richard as information started coming in, but apparently everybody else on the force thought he was kind of crazy. Nobody believed that Richard had done all of the things that he was being accused of. It seemed like the MOs for all the murders were too different. So Pat claims that he was kind of like a laughingstock among the other officers and detectives until about 4 years into the investigation, when he was vindicated and he was able to prove that Richard was indeed a violent hitman. And then he kind of became the hero of the story. And in sticking with the very typical homicide detective archetypes, Pat nearly lost his marriage over the case. He was working so long and hard. He missed out on time with his kids, and his family was threatened at points. And no doubt Pat stared certain death in the face at least a few times. This retelling was extremely cinematic, especially in Philip Carlo's book. And it was 1985 that Pat came up with a plan to take down our boy Rich once and for all. And that plan was all in the hands of this man, Dominic Prolifrone.
I portrayed myself as a hitman. Told him I worked for the wise guys downtown New York. And my brother was a good fella downtown, and I went by the name of Dominic Michael Provenzano.
Now, Dominic is probably the most 80s New Jersey, obviously undercover cop that I have ever seen. I am truly obsessed with this person. He is the creme de la creme. I love him. He's such a character. He just makes me laugh. Dominic was an ATF agent, and I believe he had a little bit of experience with this type of work, and obviously, like, performance of a lifetime. Now, Pat was actually able to use Phil Solimene for this task because Phil was in prison for, I don't know, something not murder related, and they were able to convince Phil to introduce Richard to Dominic. And so Dominic was kind of able to instantly gain Richard's trust, as he, I guess, had a reference. Dominic spoke with Richard on the phone multiple times. It's all recorded, and Richard was pretty candid. They made arrangements to meet, and when they did, they discussed Richard supplying Dominic with some guns. They also discussed cyanide a lot, which Dominic said that he could supply to Richard. Dominic told Richard that he wanted to poison this guy he knew by lacing some of his cocaine with cyanide. And Richard assured him that can be done. And during these conversations, Richard also admitted that he'd been doing just that.
You willing to go out on a contract?
If the price is right, I'll talk to anybody.
Yeah?
Sure.
And you mean to tell me your way is nice and clean and nothing fucking shows up?
Well, it may show, my friend, but it's quiet. It's not messy. It's not noisy. It's not,
Yeah, but how the fuck do you put it together, like, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, there's always a way. There's a will, there's a way, my friend.
We used to sit down, we talk. Either we'd go to those tables over there and get away from people, and we discuss how to murder people.
I just have a few problems I want to dispose of. I have some rats I want to get rid of.
Yeah. The only fucking thing I don't understand, don't you use a fucking piece of iron to get rid of these fucking people? You use this fucking cyanide?
Why be messy? You can do it nice and calm.
Now, there were a few meetups and discussions and plans, and it all culminated on December 17th, 1986. Richard and Dominic met up. The plan was to poison their Mark, who was another undercover cop, and by poisoning the Mark's sandwich. Dominic was to provide both the cyanide and the sandwiches generously. And Richard was supposed to go swap out his car. So they met up, and then they were supposed to both, Dominic gave Richard the cyanide and the sandwiches. And then Richard was supposed to go switch out his car for a van so that he could pick up the guy and kill him in the van. Dominic was supposed to go get the guy. So, they were going to meet back here with the guy and the van and the cyanide sandwiches. But things kind of went south because after Richard left with the cyanide, he tested out the cyanide on a stray dog. And it did not kill the dog. So Richard instantly knew that this was a setup. So he went home instead. But the cops were ready. They had been staking out his home this whole time, and they kind of saw what was happening, but they were like, you know what, I think we have enough evidence on him. Clearly there's a conspiracy to commit murder with him and Dominic. And so they decided to take him out then and there. They had 15 cop cars, and it took several men to subdue this giant individual.
Local police, state police, Division of Criminal Justice investigators, county personnel. There was no place for him to go. So he stopped his car. He was told to get out of the car, and he did not. So he was taken out of the car, and he was placed face down on a street in a position where we thought we were safe. And then I handcuffed him. That guy's big. I did everything I could to get one click on the handcuffs.
Richard was taken into police custody, and he was charged with 5 murders, 6 weapons violation, attempted murder for the undercover sting, robbery, and attempted robbery. Richard was first tried for the murders of Danny Deppner and Gary Smith. I think that's what they had the most evidence for. And at that trial, both Barbara Deppner, Percy House, and also Dominic Profilone testified against him.
Dominic Polifrone's tapes had nailed Kuklinski, but in court, the Iceman greeted the undercover cop with a smile.
He seemed to be quite cheery about saying hello to you.
Well, I reciprocated. The only thing is I'm going home, and he's going to a different environment at the present time.
After being found guilty, Richard received a life sentence. The prosecution was hoping for the death penalty, and it was on the table, but the jury did not feel that there was enough solid evidence to feel okay with giving Richard the death penalty, which, you know what, I think that's totally reasonable. Like, I don't think here is the right place to get into, like, is the death penalty right or wrong? That's like a super interesting question, and we could go on and on about that. But I think if you are going to go for the death penalty, it needs to be some like solid AF evidence. And like they had a lot of like, yeah. Anyway, do you agree? Am I wrong? Go for it. Anyway, so after Richard's sentence, he then decided to plead guilty to the murders of Paul Hoffman, George Malaban, and Louis Masgay. For George and Louis, Richard was convicted and sentenced to 2 additional life sentences to be served consecutively, which, of course, added literally nothing to the sentence he was already given. They didn't bother convicting Richard of Hoffman's murder because there was not enough evidence, and they felt he'd be locked up for long enough, and it's like, why waste money on another trial?
I shot George Malaban 5 times. Louis Masgay on July 1st, 1981. I shot him once in the back of the head.
When the judge asked him why he had killed the 2 men, Kuklinski replied,
It was due to business.
After all was said and done, Richard agreed to take part in the now infamous Iceman Confessions by HBO. The first 2 parts are a regular interview, and the third part is an interview with Dr. Park Diaz, who spent an additional 13 hours with Richard. Now, Dr. Diaz is a super high-profile psychiatrist who's been involved in many high-profile cases, including Betty Broderick, Arthur Shawcross, Jeffrey Dahmer, Joel Rifkin, Ted Kaczynski, and the DC Snipers. So this man seemingly knows what he's talking about and is extremely credible. Now, these interviews, the entire set of 3, are what got the eye of Philip Carlo and what got him interested in Richard. And he got in contact with Richard after that, and he based his book off of 240 hours of interviewing Richard, as well as interviewing the police and Richard's family, et cetera, et cetera. And all those hours of interviewing, documentary, and book culminated in what I think is reasonable to take as Richard's claims and Richard's confessions. People have been horrified by this information. The way that Richard talks in this documentary is cold and callous. His demeanor is very scary. He talks about the awful, horrific crimes he committed, and he also comes off as like very raw and vulnerable at times.
I've never felt sorry for anything I've done other than hurting my family. The only thing I feel sorry for. I'm not looking for forgiveness, and I'm not repenting. No, I'm wrong. I'm wrong. I do want my family to forgive me. Oh, boy. I'm gonna make this one. Oh, shit. This would never be me. This would not be me. I feel for my family. You see the Iceman cry. Not very macho. But I've heard people that mean everything to me. But the only people that mean anything to me.
Like, damn, you know? The part with Dr. Diaz is especially interesting to me, personally. Richard seems to be genuinely curious to find out why he is the way that he is. Clearly, it seems like it was the idea was put forth to him like, hey, we've got this really amazing psychiatrist and we would like to film you sitting down and talking to him and him like, you know, kind of assessing you. Is that something you'd be interested in? And it's, you know, because at one point they're like, why did you agree to do this or whatever? And it seems like he had a genuine curiosity about his own mind and how it came to be the way that it was. There's some very fascinating clips that I'd like to highlight, but I'd also highly recommend watching all the tapes in their entirety. They're all on YouTube, and they are fascinating, even though I will get to something. So for the clips that I'm going to show you, I'll just give you a little bit of context because they're pretty long as it is and they require some context. So Richard was explaining that one day he was out driving and there were these guys in a van next to him that were kind of messing with him on the road. So he pulled over and he took out a gun, and when they approached him, he shot them all dead. Now, Dr. Diaz was kind of probing at him and pushing him very slightly about his behavior. And then you will see what happens next. So just settle in. This is some long clips.
You almost made me mad.
I know. What made you mad about that?
I don't know, but you almost did.
Can you figure out what it is?
No.
Try to look at it. Look at what made you mad there.
I don't know. I think it must have been something you said.
Yeah.
Obviously, but I don't know what it was.
Could it be that I was challenging you and it sounded judgmental?
Could be. Yeah, it could be. Because you've got me annoyed with you now.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
How mad are you?
Not bad. Pretty. I feel a little flushed. So that means that I've reached a point in my life that I'm a little annoyed.
What would you like to do?
Doesn't matter. I don't think it's gone to the point that I'm actually gonna do anything stupid. Just curious to myself why it happened. I don't know why it happened. I'm actually almost glad it did happen because you had a chance to see something, but I don't know why it happened.
Did you feel I was criticizing you?
Yes,
Is that what did it?
I think so. I
'Cause
think that's the part that did it.
who used to criticize you the most?
Of course, my father.
Yeah.
So when I watched this, it felt very genuine to me. It felt like a man who was genuinely curious about himself, who understood that he was an awful human being and that he had serious regrets about how he treated his family, and the way that his life went. However, there have been many criticisms regarding these interviews, as well as Carlo's books, which, you kind of have to lump them all together. They bore out of the same situation. And that is what we will finally get into now. And I know some people have been anticipating this, so here it is. The first glaring discrepancy that I noticed when I first watched these interviews was this. Here is Richard in his first set of interviews.
Kill.
I have an approximate guess. Approximate, we'll go with more than 100.
Which seems quite a bit different than his answer later with Dr. Diaz.
If I understand you correctly, you're positive you killed more than 50 people. And
Definitely.
you think you probably killed more than 100 people.
Definitely.
You're sure of that one.
Definitely.
But not sure it's more than 200.
I wouldn't say definitely to that.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
I would say less than 200 people.
Well, you tell me.
It's not less than 200 people.
You killed more than 200 people.
Sure. Yep. I killed basically 100 people when I was a young man, before I even knew anybody. Too much. One part of my life, I killed people for nothing. Just for somebody to look at me wrong, I would kill them. Stab them, shoot them.
And that was just the start. Richard admitted to many, many murders, as you can see, hundreds, in these series of interviews. So many of them I've talked about throughout this last series. The rats, the chopping off of tongues and dicks and shoving them up people's asses and throwing people off buildings, setting people on fire. The list goes on. But absolutely none of them can be corroborated. The bottom line is that with the exception of the last 5 murders that Richard was actually charged with, there is no proof of any of it. There's no proof that Richard killed hundreds of people. There's no proof that he killed anyone for the mafia. The murders that Richard alleged he took part in with or for the mafia were all known to be committed by other people. There was a lot of the mafia ended up being taken down and people were ratting on each other, and it was this, big takedown, and not one person mentioned Richard Kuklinski as being a hitman for them. Not one person mentioned that he was there for the murder of Jimmy Hoffa or Paul Castellano or any of those guys that I mentioned. And in these interviews also, by the way, Roy DeMeo was murdered. Duh, that's obviously how he would end, and Richard took credit for that too. Again, no evidence that he was responsible for that at all. Most people believe that Richard perhaps worked with the mob, and I think that he did. Like there was evidence, he was making money, but most people believe that he mostly worked with the mob just simply in the porn business, which was a very lucrative business at the time. And perhaps as well in the buying and selling of stolen goods. He was a criminal, absolutely. He was stealing and he was violent. He was a murderer. He killed 5 people. Like, that's no joke. He's, that's serial killer level, killing 5 people. But it doesn't look like Richard was involved with the mafia in any meaningful way, and especially not as a hitman with Roy DeMeo or involved in the Gemini Lounge. There's no pictures of him coming out of the Gemini Lounge or being around there at all. There's not photographed with any mafia people. Nothing. And I will say Richard's claim, as I mentioned before, was that he was so slick, so efficient at killing that he was never indicated. Nobody knew his real name. No one knew where he lived. But maybe that's because he was never there at all, which makes a lot more sense when you compare all of the alleged hits and all of his alleged murders that were so clean and so professional and that he was never detected in with the murders that he was later nabbed for, which sounded a lot more sloppy and way more realistic and ended in him getting caught. Now, it's interesting because it's the second part of the series, the part 2 of the 3 in total, where Richard really starts talking about all of his mob hits and his involvement with Roy DeMeo, and he really veers off course into what most people believe are huge lies. And in this, his demeanor completely changes. You can tell he's sitting there, he's like loving it. And I'm sure he was like bored in jail and just, was having a good day chatting with someone, But you can see here.
I'm just a hardworking expediter of sorts. I looked at myself as a person who did something that somebody wanted done, and they paid me a good price.
Philip Carlo says that he interviewed Richard for 240 hours. And I don't know what this man's motivation was. It kind of seems, I guess, that maybe he just took everything at face value without really looking into anything and then put it all out in this rather long book full of the fantasies of a random psychotic murderer. Now, the book is written well. It's super interesting. Reading it for the first time, it's fascinating. And my God, if it were true, it would be the most amazing book in the world. But it doesn't appear to be. It's actually galling that Carlo was able to get away with saying that all of this was true without a shred of evidence. His book landed on the New York Times bestseller list. The book did well until it didn't. And so I guess the real question is, why would Richard lie like that? Boredom? To me, that seems like the most likely answer. Who knows? He's locked up for life. His family pretty much all hated him, with the exception of Merrick, who I believe still kept in contact with Richard. I think there's a million reasons. Well, I think boredom is probably the number one reason for somebody who's locked up for the rest of their life. And, he seems like a guy who likes fucking with people, and I do believe that he is very resentful of the world. But the bigger question is, why the fuck would I go through 4 episodes on this man? Why would I spend 4 weeks detailing all of this man's lies? What the hell, Madison? Well, okay, for one thing, I still think it's an interesting story, and this is just what I like to spend my time doing, I guess. But it's amazing to me that this man was able to get away with all of this lying for so long. 3 HBO specials about him. He got to be interviewed by a world-class psychiatrist for another 4 days. HBO is not some rinky-dink network, you guys. This is HBO. There must have been executives, researchers, producers, you name it, and all of them just accepted this man shoveling bullshit directly into their faces. Was there no fact-checking? And then Philip Carlo wrote this book. It's a New York Times bestseller. There's a movie made about him with Michael Shannon. People really took this guy serious. And there's Michael Shannon is in it. Winona Ryder. what's his name? The guy who was in Goodfellas. I forget his name. Like, there's big names in this movie. It was a big movie. There's multiple books, like, with zero evidence. Everyone was duped. And this shit is still going on. I was reading an article from 2019, and there was the person was talking about this case as if everything in his book was complete fact. I remember back in high school when I first started to get into true crime, and I found the Iceman Confessions. And I, being the extremely popular cool kid that I was in grade 11, I was sitting in my basement bedroom, getting high and watching YouTube videos. And I watched this shit and I was floored. It was truly one of the most interesting things that I had ever seen. I ate that shit up. I read the book. I was jaw to the floor. This is the craziest story I have ever heard. It's an important lesson in the importance of skepticism within the true crime community, or any facet of life, really. We should be skeptical of things. We should be skeptical, true crime-wise. We should be skeptical of evidence, all evidence. We should be skeptical of the forensic sciences, especially the ones that are not as cut and dry as they are portrayed to be by so-called experts, which I talk about a lot. We should be skeptical of eyewitnesses, criminal profilers. I love reading about criminal profilers, but the entire criminal profiling sciences, if you can call them that, were created on the backs of interviews with serial killers. And as this case so clearly demonstrates, we should be highly skeptical of the word of convicted murderers. Because they're liars, a lot of them. And look, I personally think that it's very likely that Richard murdered more than 5 people. A lot of people are like, he just killed 5 people. And definitely, that's what we know that's what we know. But I do think it's possible that he murdered more people. I personally think that it's very possible that the first boy that he ever claimed to have killed, with the closet thing or whatever, I think it's possible that that is a true story. Only because, remember, Merrick claimed that Richard told her about that murder when she was a teenager. Like, he was like confiding in her in like really weird ways. And I just don't understand why he would say that to her if it wasn't true. It's one thing to say something like that to your own daughter, which is a beyond messed up thing to do psychologically, obviously. But it is like crazy to like just concoct a lie like that. Just that would just be to fuck with her. And that doesn't make any sense. And if that murder actually happened, I think it's very unlikely that he just murdered one person when he was a teenager, and then like it was years and years and years and years later that he just like up and murders 5 people. So I do believe that it's possible that there are a lot of aspects to his confessions that are true, and I think maybe he just really liked the idea of like being a mafia hitman, and he thought that sounded super badass, so he went in that direction. So I don't know. It's impossible to know one way or the other, so it's probably a better idea to take everything that he says as a lie rather than like speculate as to like, I think this is true and I think that's true. But I think it's definitely possible that there's a lot that could be true. I think that the idea that he, especially when he sat down with Dr. Diaz, that he like did try to be honest as possible about his like his life and his personality so that he could get a real assessment from Mr. Diaz. I really wonder whether or not Mr. Diaz thought that he was lying. Like, I have to assume a guy like that does some research, but that's unclear to me as well. I don't know. I'm very much interested to hear what people think. Now, and with the whole killing the boy too, sorry, I forgot to get to the point, but like a lot of people say that that is probably not true because, and as with all of his crimes, if you go back and you look in the newspapers, there's no mention of a boy going missing or anything in that neighborhood and area. And that's a good point. But I do think that it's possible that this very poor Irish kid living in public housing in New Jersey in the 70s could go missing without people giving a shit. I think that probably happened a lot. But anyway, who knows? It's just a theory of mine. If you can prove it wrong, please let me know. I think Richard was a bad guy. He was a murderer. I do believe that he was a resentful man who suffered horrible neglect and abuse as a child. And I mean, his brother did turn out just as bad. Everything about his brother appears to be true. There is evidence and articles about him killing that little girl. He's in prison for that. Also, unless Richard's family was also lying, Richard was a very abusive man with a horrific temper who seemed to genuinely fear that he may kill his entire family. I believe that he was a very lonely and hurt man. I believe what he said about his family, but honestly, I don't really know what to believe anymore. And also, I think I don't know, I just think about, I think about domestic violence a lot because I've been seeing just so much horrific stories of domestic violence. And this is like, one of the worst situations of domestic violence. I think it's shocking to me reading back about everything that his family has to say, assuming that they are telling the truth. It's shocking to me that he didn't end up killing them. And there's some interviews with Barbara and her daughters later in life, and Barbara and Kristen actually had plotted to kill Richard. They had made a plan together and didn't tell Merrick because they knew that she would probably tell him. But they had plotted to poison him, but they didn't end up doing it, according to them, because they thought that in the event that he didn't die, that he would kill them, and they feared that. So I don't know. I think about domestic violence a lot. It's so shocking. I listened to a podcast episode about this horrific case of domestic violence recently, and it just destroyed me. Part of it is so shocking to me, the amount of people who end up dead after a domestic violence situation, or a life of domestic violence, really. It's something that I've really never experienced. It has never touched my life in any meaningful way. I really don't, nobody close to me or in any, have I ever thought we're in a relationship that was even close to any sort of physical violence or anything. So it is like, it's something to me that is like shocking whenever I hear about it, and it seems so prevalent. But anyway, we'll get into more of that in another day. So Richard Kuklinski died on March 6, 2005. Now, his death was another scenario that has fallen under speculation. He was apparently moved to a medical facility the previous year after being diagnosed with Kawasaki disease. Now, the story goes that he had specifically asked the doctors to attempt to revive him if it came down to it. But Barbara had signed a do not resuscitate order on his behalf. So when he did go into cardiac arrest at one point, they just let him die. Now, I agree that something sounds fishy here. I'm not sure why Barbara would be his next of kin, because they were legally divorced. That happened soon after his conviction. So if he had expressed wishes to be resuscitated, I don't know why they would take Barbara's word over his. I think a lot of people think this is kind of fishy, and I don't have answers to it. If anybody does, please put them in the comments. That would be great. To this day, I mentioned there are articles being written about Richard taking his confession seriously and stating that he killed hundreds of people. So, like, what does this make Richard? I mean, he killed a minimum of 5 people, maybe more. He had a horrific childhood. I think it's clear that he had some major psychological issues. He was an evil man. Personally, I think it's impossible to know without having more knowledge of what he really did. There are a lot of people who talk online about Richard who seem to be very sure one way or the other, who, either like defend the idea that everything he said was true, or people who say, he was just a kind of crappy criminal, he killed 5 people, that's it. But at the end of the day, there's no evidence one way or the other. There's also no solid evidence that he wasn't a part of all this stuff. The most compelling evidence that he did not do all of the stuff that he did is that it just logically does not make sense. there have been people who've come out and said, like, rats just, they don't eat live humans. Like, that just wouldn't happen. Or, you know, there's all these people that he claimed to just be killing every which way, everywhere. Like, this, where are the articles about them? Where are the family members? Like, that's serial killer level, like, not even serial killer, like, that's like insane serial killer level murdering numbers. I don't want to like regret things, but I do think if I were to do this series over again, I would do it a little bit differently. When I first set out, I thought it was going to be 2 parts. And so I kind of started it as like, I was just going to like give his side of the story and then kind of flip it. I didn't realize it was going to be so long. So I feel like I feel kind of shitty about like leading up the way that I did and then flipping it like 4 episodes later. So sorry about that. I did have a few sleepless nights over that. But because I realized that, like, you know, I'm putting these out 1 week after another. So it's like it's taking me a really long time to like get to the end. So yeah, but you know, I'm just this is a huge experiment for me. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just learning how to do this on the fly. And I really wish, and my goal is to be at a place where I have enough time to like write out 4 parts and, you know, record them all before I put them out. But I'm not in that space right now. I just try to act like I have millions of viewers because I believe one day I will. But I'm just a random lady on the internet with 400 subscribers, and I'm loving it. It's fun. There's a lot of people, there's like a good little chunk of people who watch my videos and who say nice things, and I love that. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for supporting this channel. We'll see what becomes of it. And yeah, what a crazy story, eh? Sorry if I angered you. What are you going to do, right? If you're interested in reaching out to me, you can do so in the comments. You can email me, hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. You can find me on Instagram at whosknockingpodcast, Twitter whosknockingpod, and sign up for my newsletter. And please stay safe out there, because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.